He was handed over like trash wrapped in pity. A crippled horse, deemed unfit for anything but disposal, given to a boy who had nothing, not even a roof over his head. The millionaire smirked as he made the offer, certain the gesture would be forgotten by morning. But what that homeless child did with that broken animal would shake an entire town to its core and prove that sometimes the most damaged souls are the ones destined to soar the highest. This is a story about a gift no one wanted, and a miracle no one saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun painted Lexington, Kentucky in shades of amber and gold, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. Along the pristine white fences of Whitmore estates, thoroughbreds grazed in pastures so green they seemed unreal, each horse worth more than most families would earn in a lifetime. The estate sprawled across 300 acres of prime bluegrass country, a monument to wealth built on the backs of champions. Inside the main stable, the air smelled of fresh hay, leather, and money. Brass nameplates gleamed on every stall door, each one bearing the lineage of horses bred for speed, power, and glory. Robert Whitmore stood in the center aisle, his polished boots reflecting the overhead lights. He was a man who commanded attention without effort, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back from a face that rarely smiled. His stable was his kingdom, and every inch of it reflected his obsession with perfection. Visitors often remarked that his horses looked like living sculptures, and Whitmore accepted the compliment as fact rather than flattery. He had built his fortune on knowing which bloodlines mattered, which trainers delivered results, and which horses were worth the investment. Everything in his world had a price tag, and he never paid more than something was worth. At the far end of the stable, separated from the pristine show horses by a wooden partition, stood a single stall that seemed forgotten. The nameplate was tarnished, the door scratched and dull. Inside, a young colt shifted nervously, his gray coat damp with sweat despite the cool air. His name was Ash, though no one called him that anymore. Most of the stable hands referred to him as the mistake, the unfortunate result of a breeding that should have produced a champion but instead delivered disappointment. Ash's left front leg bore a crook just above the knee, a deformity visible even to untrained eyes. He had been born that way, and the veterinarians had confirmed what Whitmore already knew. The colt would never race, never win, never justify the cost of his feed. Tom Hayes, the stable manager, stood beside Whitmore, his weathered face creased with discomfort. Tom had worked with horses all his life, and he knew the look in Whitmore's eyes. It was the same look he got before making a cut, before deciding something had outlived its usefulness. Tom shifted his weight, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He had tried to advocate for Ash when the colt was born, suggesting they give him time, that sometimes young horses grew into their bodies, that the leg might strengthen. Whitmore had dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. Time was money, and Ash was neither. The decision to dispose of Ash had been made weeks ago, but Whitmore was a man who understood optics. Simply putting down a horse looked bad, especially when journalists occasionally toured the estate for puff pieces about his breeding program. He needed a solution that appeared generous, something that would let him rid himself of the burden while maintaining his carefully cultivated image. The answer had come to him one morning while driving through downtown Lexington. He had seen a boy, thin and ragged, digging through a trash bin behind a restaurant. The image had stuck with him not out of sympathy, but because it sparked an idea. That boy could take the horse. It would be framed as charity, a wealthy man giving an unfortunate child a chance at something better. The media would love it, and Whitmore would be free of the colt without the mess of euthanasia. The fact that the boy had no means to care for a horse, no land, no resources was irrelevant. That was the boy's problem, not his. If the horse ended up neglected or sold for slaughter, well, Whitmore could claim ignorance. He had done his part. Tom cleared his throat, pulling Whitmore from his thoughts. "You really going through with this?" he asked quietly. His tone carried a weight that Whitmore chose to ignore. "Of course," Whitmore replied, his voice clipped and businesslike. "The boy needs help, and we have a horse that serves no purpose here." It's a perfect arrangement. Tom's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He had learned long ago that arguing with Robert Whitmore was pointless. The man's mind was a steel trap, and once it snapped shut on a decision, nothing could pry it open. The boy in question was named Daniel Brooks, though most people called him Danny. He was 12 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that hung in his eyes and clothes that had been worn thin by too many nights on the streets. Danny's story was one that had become all too common in the shadows of Lexington's prosperity. His father had died 2 years earlier in a construction accident, and his mother, unable to cope with the grief and the bills, had succumbed to addiction. Social services had been called, but Danny had slipped through the cracks, avoiding the foster system by living on the move. He slept in abandoned buildings, under bridges, in the corners of parks where the police didn't patrol. He survived on scraps from dumpsters, the occasional kindness of strangers, and his own stubborn will to keep going. Danny had learned to be invisible. He knew which alleys were safe, which shop owners would chase him away, and which ones might leave day-old bread by the back door. He avoided other homeless adults, knowing that desperation could make people dangerous. His only real refuge was St. Augustine's Church, where Father Patrick O'Brien allowed him to sit in the back pews during services. No questions asked. The old priest had tried to convince Danny to accept help, to go to a shelter, to let someone contact social services. But Danny refused every time. He had heard the stories about foster homes, about being separated from everything familiar, and he would rather take his chances on the streets. On the morning that would change his life, Danny was crouched behind Maggie's Corner Diner, a small brick building tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The diner's owner, Margaret Foster, was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled into a perpetual bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had noticed Danny months ago and had made it her quiet mission to ensure the boy didn't starve. Every morning, she left a bag of leftover biscuits or a container of soup near the dumpster, always in the same spot, always early enough that Danny could grab it before anyone else saw. She never mentioned it, never made a fuss, and Danny never thanked her directly. It was an unspoken agreement, a small act of humanity in a world that often felt devoid of it. Danny had just retrieved the bag when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He froze, his heart hammering. A sleek black SUV pulled into the alley, far too clean and expensive to belong there. Danny's instinct was to run, but curiosity held him in place. The driver's door opened, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. It was Robert Whitmore, though Danny didn't know that yet. Whitmore's eyes scanned the alley with distaste, his expression suggesting he had stepped into something foul. His gaze landed on Danny, and for a moment, neither moved. "You," Whitmore called out, his voice sharp. "Come here." Danny's first thought was to bolt, but something in the man's tone suggested this wasn't a threat. Slowly, he stepped forward, clutching the bag of biscuits to his chest like a shield. Whitmore looked him up and down, taking in the torn sneakers, the jacket 2 sizes too big, the dirt smudged across the boy's cheek. "Perfect," Whitmore muttered, though whether he was speaking to Danny or himself wasn't clear. "What's your name?" Whitmore asked. Danny hesitated, then answered quietly. "Daniel." "Danny. Do you have a family, parents, a place to live?" Danny's throat tightened. He shook his head. Whitmore's lips curved into something that might have been a smile but didn't reach his eyes. "How would you like to?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Own a horse?" he asked. The question was so absurd that Danny thought he had misheard. "A horse?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore nodded. "I have a colt that needs a home. He's yours if you want him. No cost, no strings. Just take him." Danny's mind raced. He had seen horses before, of course, in parades and on television, but he had never been near one. The idea that someone would just give him a horse made no sense. "Why?" Danny asked, the word coming out sharper than he intended. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "Let's call it charity. I'm a generous man, and you look like you could use a break." Danny wanted to refuse, wanted to tell the stranger in his expensive suit to leave him alone, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the desperation of his situation, the bone-deep weariness of living day to day with nothing. Maybe it was the faint hope that this, whatever it was, might lead to something better. Or maybe it was just the curiosity of a 12-year-old boy who had been offered something impossible. "All right," Danny said finally, his voice small. Whitmore's smile widened, and he gestured for Danny to get into the SUV. The boy climbed into the back seat, the leather cool and foreign against his skin. As they drove toward Whitmore Estates, Danny stared out the window, watching the city give way to open fields and white fences. He didn't know what waited for him at the end of this ride, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something flicker in his chest. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was close. The drive from downtown Lexington to Whitmore Estates took less than 20 minutes, but for Danny, it felt like crossing into another world. The SUV hummed quietly along smooth roads that wound through rolling hills dotted with grazing horses. Danny pressed his face close to the window, watching the landscape transform from cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts to manicured lawns and sprawling pastures. He had lived his entire life within a 5-mile radius of the city's poorest neighborhoods, and this place seemed like something pulled from a magazine or a movie, beautiful but unreal. Robert Whitmore said nothing during the drive, his eyes fixed on the road, one hand resting casually on the steering wheel. Occasionally, he glanced at Danny in the rearview mirror, studying the boy with the detached interest of someone examining an object rather than a person. Danny felt the weight of that gaze but kept his focus on the window, unsure of what to say or whether he should say anything at all. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath the tires. When the SUV finally turned through a pair of tall iron gates, Danny's breath caught in his throat. The entrance to Whitmore Estates was marked by a stone archway with the name carved in elegant script, flanked by perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds bursting with color. Beyond the gates, the driveway stretched forward like a ribbon, lined with white fences that seemed to go on forever. In the distance, a massive house rose against the sky, its columns gleaming white in the afternoon sun. Danny had never seen a home so large, and for a moment, he wondered if Whitmore lived there alone or if dozens of people shared the space. The SUV veered away from the main house, following a narrower path that led toward a cluster of buildings near the edge of the property. These were the stables, though Danny didn't know that yet. As they approached, he could see people moving about, some leading horses, others carrying buckets or pushing wheelbarrows filled with hay. The activity was purposeful and organized, everyone seeming to know exactly what they were doing. Danny felt a pang of anxiety. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. Whatever this man wanted from him, whatever this so-called gift entailed, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that there was a catch. Whitmore parked near the largest of the buildings and stepped out without a word. Danny followed, his worn sneakers crunching on the gravel. The air here smelled different, clean and earthy, with the faint scent of hay and horses. It was overwhelming in its intensity, so unlike the stale, acrid smells of the city. A man emerged from the stable, his shirt dusted with bits of straw, his face weathered and lined in a way that spoke of years spent outdoors. This was Tom Hayes, though Danny wouldn't learn his name until later. Tom's eyes flicked from Whitmore to Danny, his expression tightening with something that looked like disapproval. "This is the boy," Whitmore said, his tone flat. Tom nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Danny's thin frame and ragged clothing. "He looks like he hasn't eaten in a week," Tom muttered, his voice low but not low enough to escape Whitmore's hearing. Whitmore ignored the comment, gesturing for Tom to lead the way. The stable manager hesitated, then turned and walked toward the building. Danny followed, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to expect, but the tension between the two men was palpable, and it made him uneasy. Inside the stable, the air was cooler, almost dim after the brightness of the outdoors. Rows of stalls lined either side of a wide central aisle, each one housing a horse. Danny had never been this close to so many animals before, and the sheer size of them took his breath away. The horses shifted and snorted, their heads poking over stall doors, ears swiveling toward the newcomers. Some of them gleamed like polished wood, their coats sleek and healthy, their eyes bright with intelligence. Danny felt a surge of awe mixed with fear. These creatures were beautiful, but they were also massive and unpredictable, at least to someone who had never been around them. Tom led them past the pristine stalls toward the far end of the stable, where the light grew dimmer and the air smelled faintly of damp straw. Here, separated from the others by a wooden partition, was a single stall that looked forgotten. The door was scuffed and dull, the nameplate tarnished. Inside, a young horse stood with his head lowered, his gray coat patchy and uneven. Danny stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the animal. The horse was smaller than the others, his ribs visible beneath the coat, and there was something wrong with one of his legs. It bent at an odd angle, a crook just above the knee that made the limb look fragile and weak. "This is Ash," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying a sadness that Danny didn't fully understand. "He was born here, but he's got a defect in his leg. Can't race, can't work. Mr. Whitmore doesn't have use for him anymore." Danny's eyes moved from the horse to Whitmore, who stood with his arms crossed, watching the boy with an expression that was impossible to read. "So you're giving him to me?" Danny said, the words coming out slowly as if he were testing them. Whitmore nodded. "Consider it an opportunity. You take care of him and he's yours. No obligations, no strings." Danny looked back at Ash, who had lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the boy. There was something in that gaze, a wariness that mirrored Danny's own, a sense of being unwanted and cast aside. For the first time since stepping out of the SUV, Danny felt a flicker of connection, not to Whitmore or Tom or this strange, overwhelming place, but to the horse standing in the shadows. This animal had been discarded, deemed worthless, and in that, Danny saw a reflection of himself. He didn't know anything about horses, didn't know how to feed them or care for them or even approach them without getting hurt. But he knew what it felt like to be abandoned, and that knowledge settled over him like a weight. "I'll take him," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore's smile was sharp and brief. "Excellent. Tom will help you get started." He turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps echoing down the aisle. Danny stood frozen, watching the man disappear, and a cold realization crept over him. This wasn't charity. This was disposal. Whitmore had found a way to get rid of a problem while looking generous, and Danny had just become complicit in it. Tom sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked at Danny with a mixture of pity and frustration. "You have any idea what you just agreed to?" he asked. Danny shook his head. Tom's jaw tightened. "A horse isn't a pet. He needs food, water, shelter, medical care. He needs space to move, exercise, grooming. You got any of that?" Danny's stomach sank. He hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered the practicalities of what it meant to own a horse. He barely had enough for himself, surviving day to day on scraps and luck. How was he supposed to care for an animal that weighed hundreds of pounds and needed constant attention? "I'll figure it out," Danny said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Tom studied him for a long moment, then sighed again. "Come on. Let me show you what you're dealing with." He opened the stall door and stepped inside, moving slowly and deliberately. Ash shifted nervously, his ears flicking back, but he didn't bolt. Tom placed a hand on the horse's neck, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you." Danny watched from the doorway, too afraid to step inside. The horse looked so much larger up close, his muscles twitching beneath the gray coat, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Tom beckoned Danny forward, and after a moment's hesitation, the boy took a tentative step into the stall. The smell of hay and horse was stronger here, almost overwhelming. Ash's eyes followed him, wide and wary. Danny reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, and barely brushed the horse's shoulder. The coat was rough and warm beneath his touch, and Ash flinched but didn't pull away. "It's okay," Danny whispered, more to himself than to the horse. "I'm scared too." Tom showed Danny the basics over the next hour, explaining how to fill the water bucket, where the feed was stored, and how to measure out the right amount. He demonstrated how to brush the horse's coat, working in slow, gentle strokes that seemed to calm Ash despite his nervousness. Danny listened intently, trying to absorb everything, but it felt like drinking from a fire hose. There was so much he didn't know, so much that could go wrong. Tom's voice was patient but firm, and Danny could tell the man didn't think this arrangement would last. He was going through the motions because Whitmore had ordered it, but his eyes said he expected the boy to fail. When the lesson was over, Tom handed Danny a small bag of feed and a worn halter. "This'll get you through a couple days, but after that, you're on your own. Whitmore's not going to pay for feed or vet bills. That's your responsibility now." Danny took the bag, the weight of it settling in his arms like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. He looked at Ash, who had retreated to the back corner of the stall, and felt a surge of determination mixed with fear. He had agreed to this, had accepted the horse, and now he had to find a way to make it work. Tom walked Danny out of the stable, and for a moment, they stood in the fading light, the sun sinking low on the horizon. "You got somewhere to keep him?" Tom asked. Danny's throat tightened. He thought of the abandoned warehouse by the river, the place he had been sleeping for the past few weeks. It was little more than a crumbling shell, but it had a roof, and behind it was a small patch of overgrown grass. "Maybe." Tom shook his head, his expression grim. "That horse needs more than maybe. He needs proper shelter, clean water, and enough space to move. If you can't give him that, you should walk away now before this gets worse." Danny's fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not walking away." Tom stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you're going to need help." He pulled a scrap of paper and a pencil from his pocket, scribbling something down. "This is my number. If you run into trouble, call me. I can't promise much, but I'll do what I can." He handed the paper to Danny, who took it with shaking hands. "Why?" Danny asked. "Why would you help me?" Tom's gaze softened, just a fraction. "Because that horse didn't ask to be born the way he was, and you didn't ask to be in the situation you're in. Neither of you deserves to be thrown away." Danny nodded, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. Tom turned and walked back toward the stable, leaving Danny alone with the bag of feed and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. As darkness fell, Danny made his way back to the warehouse, the bag of feed slung over his shoulder, his mind racing. He had a horse now, a responsibility that felt impossibly large, and no clear idea of how to manage it. But as he walked through the quiet streets, past the places he had learned to call home, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, not yet, but the faint stirring of purpose. Ash needed him, and in a strange way, Danny needed Ash too. They were two broken things in a world that didn't care, and maybe, just maybe, they could survive together. The next morning, Danny woke before dawn, his body aching from another night on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse. The bag of feed sat beside him, and for a moment he stared at it, the reality of his situation crashing over him like a wave. He had a horse. The thought was surreal, almost laughable, but it was true. Somewhere across town, Ash was waiting in that dim stall, alone and uncertain, and Danny had promised to take care of him. He stood, stretching his stiff muscles, and grabbed the bag. The walk back to Whitmore Estates took over an hour on foot, his legs burning by the time he reached the gates. The stable was quiet at this early hour, most of the workers not yet arrived. Danny slipped inside, moving quietly down the aisle until he reached Ash's stall. The horse was standing in the same corner, his head lowered, and when Danny opened the door, Ash's ears flicked forward, a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "Hey," Danny said softly, setting the bag down. "I brought you breakfast." He measured out the feed as Tom had shown him, pouring it into the trough. Ash approached cautiously, sniffing the grain before lowering his head to eat. Danny watched, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, Danny fell into a routine. He would wake early, walk to the estate, feed and water Ash, and spend as much time as he could in the stall, talking to the horse in quiet tones. Ash began to relax around him, no longer flinching when Danny approached, and sometimes, when the boy brushed his coat, the horse would lean into the touch, his eyes half closing in something that looked like contentment. Danny didn't know if what he was doing was right, but he was trying, and for now that had to be enough. But the reality of the situation couldn't be ignored. The feed Tom had given him ran out after 3 days, and Danny had no money to buy more. He scoured the city for odd jobs, offering to carry groceries or sweep floors, but most people turned him away. Desperation gnawed at him, and he found himself standing outside Maggie's corner diner one evening, his stomach empty and his mind racing. Maggie stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked him over with her sharp, assessing gaze. "You look worse than usual," she said bluntly. "What's going on?" Danny hesitated. Then the words spilled out. He told her about Ash, about Whitmore's so-called gift, about the impossible task of caring for a horse when he could barely care for himself. Maggie listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she crossed her arms and shook her head. "That man's got a heart of stone," she muttered. "Giving a horse to a kid with nothing. What was he thinking?" She studied Danny for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, come inside." Danny followed her into the diner, where she filled a bag with leftover food, more than she usually gave him. She added a small envelope, and when Danny opened it, he found 2 $20 bills inside. His eyes widened, and he looked up at her, speechless. "It's not charity," Maggie said firmly. "You're going to work for it. Every morning you come here before the breakfast rush and help me prep. Chopping vegetables, washing dishes, whatever I need. In exchange, I'll feed you and give you a little cash for that horse of yours. Deal?" Danny nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "Deal." For the first time since Whitmore had driven him to the estate, Danny felt a glimmer of hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. He had a way to feed Ash, at least for now, and maybe, just maybe, he could figure out the rest. As he walked back to the warehouse that night, the envelope clutched in his hand, he thought of the gray horse waiting in the shadows. They were both struggling, both fighting to survive, but they weren't alone anymore. And that, Danny thought, might be enough to keep them going. Danny's mornings began in the dark, long before the sun touched the horizon. He would wake on the warehouse floor, his body stiff from the cold concrete, and force himself to move despite the ache in his bones. The walk to Maggie's corner diner took 15 minutes if he hurried, and he always hurried. Maggie expected him by 5:30, and being late wasn't an option. She had given him a chance when no one else would, and Danny wasn't about to squander it. The diner was always warm when he arrived, the smell of coffee and bacon grease filling the air. Maggie would be there already, her gray hair tied back, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepped for the morning rush. She never said much when Danny slipped through the back door, just nodded toward the sink or the cutting board, and he got to work without needing instruction. He learned quickly, his hands growing steadier with the knife, his movements more confident as he cracked eggs and flipped pancakes under her watchful eye. The work was hard, but it was honest, and for the first time in months, Danny felt like he was earning something rather than just surviving. Maggie paid him in cash at the end of each week, small bills tucked into an envelope that she handed over without ceremony. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy feed for Ash and occasionally a warm meal for himself. The regulars at the diner began to recognize him, some offering kind words, others simply nodding in acknowledgement. Danny kept his head down, focusing on his tasks, but the faint sense of belonging, fragile as it was, settled over him like a threadbare blanket. After his shift, Danny would walk the long road back to Whitmore Estates, his legs burning from the miles but his spirit buoyed by the routine. Ash had become the center of his life, the one constant in a world that felt perpetually unstable. Each morning when Danny arrived at the stable, the gray colt would lift his head, his ears swiveling forward, and something in Danny's chest would ease. The horse recognized him now, and that recognition felt like a small miracle. Tom Hayes had kept his promise to help, though he did so quietly, without fanfare. He would leave extra hay near Ash's stall or show Danny how to clean the horse's hooves. His instructions patient but gruff. Tom never asked about Danny's living situation, never pressed for details about where the boy went when he left the estate. It was an unspoken agreement, a silent acknowledgement that some questions were better left unanswered. But Danny could see the concern in Tom's eyes, the way they lingered on the boy's too thin frame and worn clothing. One morning, as Danny was brushing Ash's coat, Tom appeared in the doorway of the stall, his arms crossed. "You're doing better with him," Tom said, his tone carrying a hint of approval. "He's putting on a little weight, and his coat's starting to shine." Danny paused, glancing at the horse. He hadn't noticed the changes himself, too focused on the day-to-day struggle, but now that Tom mentioned it, he could see the difference. Ash's ribs were less prominent, his eyes brighter, and there was a calmness to him that hadn't been there before. "He's a good horse," Danny said quietly. Tom nodded. "He is, but he's still got that leg, and it's not going to fix itself. You need to understand that he'll never be like the others here. He'll never race, never pull a cart, never do the things horses are supposed to do." Danny looked at Ash, his hand resting on the horse's neck. "That's okay. Neither of us are what we're supposed to be." Tom studied the boy for a long moment, then nodded again, this time with something that might have been respect. As the weeks passed, Danny's bond with Ash deepened. He spent every spare moment at the stable, talking to the horse in low tones, sharing stories about his life before his father died, about the things he missed and the things he tried not to think about. Ash listened in the way only animals can, his dark eyes steady and patient, his presence a comfort that Danny had never expected to find. The horse didn't judge him, didn't pity him, didn't ask for explanations. He simply existed alongside Danny, and that was enough. But the arrangement at Whitmore Estates was tenuous at best. Robert Whitmore rarely visited the stables anymore, his attention focused on his champion horses and the upcoming racing season. He had washed his hands of Ash the moment he handed the colt over to Danny, and as far as he was concerned, the problem no longer existed. But his staff noticed the boy's presence, and not all of them were sympathetic. Some of the younger stable hands muttered about the homeless kid who had no business being there, while others ignored Danny altogether, treating him as if he were invisible. One afternoon, as Danny was filling Ash's water bucket, a voice cut through the quiet. "What are you doing here?" Danny turned to see a man he didn't recognize, tall and sharp-featured, his expensive riding boots gleaming. The man's expression was one of disdain, his eyes sweeping over Danny's ragged clothes with obvious distaste. Danny straightened, his grip tightening on the bucket. "I'm taking care of my horse." The man snorted. "Your horse? You don't own anything, kid. You're squatting in someone else's stable, feeding off their charity." Danny's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Mr. Whitmore gave him to me." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "Whitmore gave you a cripple because he didn't want to deal with it. Don't mistake that for generosity. You're doing him a favor by taking the problem off his hands. Now get out of here before I call security." Danny's heart pounded, anger and humiliation warring inside him, but he didn't move. Tom Hayes appeared then, stepping between Danny and the man. "He's got permission to be here," Tom said, his voice hard. "If you've got a problem with that, take it up with Whitmore." The man glared at Tom, then turned on his heel and strode away. Tom looked at Danny, his expression softening. "Don't let him get to you. People like that don't understand what it means to fight for something." Danny nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He finished filling the water bucket and set it inside Ash's stall, his hands shaking. The encounter had rattled him more than he wanted to admit, a stark reminder that he didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. But when Ash nudged his shoulder gently, the horse's warm breath against his neck, Danny felt his resolve harden. He might not belong here, but Ash did, and as long as the horse needed him, Danny would stay. Father Patrick O'Brien had noticed the changes in Danny. The boy still came to St. Augustine's Church, slipping into the back pew during evening services, but there was something different about him. He sat straighter, his eyes less hollow, and the priest often saw him reading, his lips moving silently as he worked through the words. One evening, after the service had ended and the other parishioners had left, Father Patrick approached Danny, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've been scarce lately," the priest said gently. "I've been worried." Danny looked up, his expression guarded. "I've been busy." Father Patrick nodded, taking a seat in the pew beside him. I've heard rumors. Something about a horse. Danny hesitated, then nodded. Mr. Whitmore gave me a colt. I've been taking care of him. The priest's eyebrows rose. That's quite a responsibility. How are you managing? Danny shrugged. I've got a job at Maggie's diner. It's enough for now. Father Patrick studied the boy, his gaze thoughtful. The church has resources. If you need help, a place to stay, someone to talk to, you don't have to do this alone. Danny shook his head. I'm fine. I've got Ash and that's all I need. The priest didn't press, but he placed a hand on Danny's shoulder. If that changes, my door is always open. Danny nodded, grateful but unwilling to accept more than he already had. He had spent too long relying on himself, and the idea of depending on others felt dangerous, like opening a door he might not be able to close. But Father Patrick's kindness lingered with him, a reminder that not everyone saw him as a burden. As autumn approached, the air in Lexington grew cooler, the leaves on the trees turning shades of gold and crimson. Danny noticed the change in Ash as well. The colt seemed more energetic, his movements less labored despite the crook in his leg. Tom had mentioned that the cooler weather was easier on horses, and Danny was grateful for it. He had begun to learn more about Ash's care, reading books he found in the church library, his progress slow but steady. The act of reading had become a refuge, a way to distract himself from the cold nights and the gnawing worry that he might not be enough for the horse he had promised to protect. One evening, as Danny was brushing Ash's coat, the horse suddenly lifted his head. His ears pricked forward. Danny followed his gaze and saw a figure standing at the entrance to the stall. It was a woman, middle-aged and well-dressed, her expression curious. She stepped closer, her eyes on Ash. "This is the colt Whitmore gave away," she said, her tone carrying a note of surprise. "I heard the story, but I didn't believe it. He looks better than I expected." Danny tensed, unsure of how to respond. The woman extended a hand. "I'm Rebecca Thornton. I run a rescue organization for retired and injured horses. Tom told me about you and Ash." Danny shook her hand cautiously. "Why are you here?" Rebecca smiled, her expression kind. "Because I wanted to see if the rumors were true. A 12-year-old boy caring for a horse everyone else had given up on. It's not a story you hear every day." She crouched beside Ash, running a hand along his leg. "This deformity, it's permanent. He'll never be sound enough for riding or work. But with the right care, he could live a good life. You're doing well with him, Danny." Her words were like a balm, easing some of the doubt that had plagued Danny since the beginning. "Thank you," he said quietly. Rebecca stood, brushing the dust from her pants. "If you ever need help, feed, medical supplies, advice, call me." She handed him a card with her name and number. "What you're doing matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." After she left, Danny stood in the stall, the card clutched in his hand, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone in this. There were people, Tom, Maggie, Father Patrick, Rebecca, who saw what he was doing and believed in it. For the first time since Whitmore had driven him to the estate, Danny allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he and Ash had a chance. The nights were growing colder, and the warehouse offered little protection against the biting wind. Danny had taken to sleeping in the stable sometimes, curled up in the corner of Ash's stall with an old blanket Tom had given him. The horse didn't seem to mind, and the warmth of his presence made the nights more bearable. It was during one of these nights, as Danny lay half asleep, that he heard footsteps approaching. He sat up, his heart racing, and saw Tom standing in the doorway, a lantern in his hand. "You can't keep sleeping here," Tom said, his voice low. "If Whitmore finds out, he'll use it as an excuse to kick you out." Danny's throat tightened. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Tom sighed, setting the lantern down. "I know. That's why I'm offering you a choice. There's a small shed behind my house, not much, but it's got a roof and a heater. You can stay there if you want. In exchange, you help me with chores around my place." Danny stared at him, unable to speak. Tom shifted uncomfortably. "It's not charity. I need the help and you need a place to sleep. That's all it is." Danny nodded slowly, his eyes stinging. Okay. Thank you. Tom nodded, picking up the lantern. Get some rest. We'll move your stuff tomorrow. As Tom walked away, Danny lay back down, his chest tight with emotion. The shed wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in a long time. And it meant he could stay close to Ash, could keep his promise to care for the horse no matter what. As he drifted off to sleep, the warmth of Ash beside him and the faint glow of the lantern fading into darkness, Danny felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt safe. The shed behind Tom Hayes' house was barely larger than a closet, its walls thin and the roof patched with mismatched shingles, but to Danny, it felt like a palace. Tom had cleared out the clutter, leaving just enough space for a narrow cot, a small table, and a lamp that cast a warm yellow glow across the cramped interior. The heater Tom had mentioned was an old electric unit that rattled when it ran, but it kept the worst of the cold at bay. Danny moved in with nothing but the clothes on his back and the worn baseball cap his father had given him years ago, the brim faded and frayed but still precious. Tom's property was modest, a few acres on the outskirts of Lexington with a small house and a barn that had seen better days. The stable manager had lived alone since his wife passed 5 years earlier, and the loneliness had settled into the bones of the place. He wasn't a man of many words, and he didn't make a fuss over Danny's arrival. He simply showed the boy where things were, the well for water, the woodpile, the latch on the barn door that stuck, and left him to settle in. That first night, Danny lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had a roof over his head, a place that was his, at least for now, and it was because someone had chosen to help him without expecting anything in return. The work Tom gave him was manageable but necessary. Danny chopped wood for the stove, fed Tom's 2 aging horses, and helped repair fences that had been neglected for too long. In exchange, Tom made sure there was food on the table and that Danny had clean clothes, hand-me-downs from a nephew who had outgrown them. The routine was grounding, and Danny found himself falling into it with a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. Every morning, he would complete his chores at Tom's place, then walk to Maggie's diner to work his shift, and finally make his way to Whitmore Estates to care for Ash. The days were long and exhausting, but they were full, and that fullness kept the loneliness at bay. Ash continued to improve under Danny's care. The colt's coat had taken on a healthy sheen, and though his leg remained crooked, he moved with more confidence, his strides less hesitant. Danny had started taking him out of the stall for short walks around the property, leading him with the halter Tom had given him. At first, Ash had been skittish, his eyes darting at every sound, but over time, he grew calmer, trusting Danny to guide him. The boy talked to the horse constantly, filling the silence with stories about his father, about the construction sites where they used to visit, about the dreams he'd had before everything fell apart. Ash would flick his ears, listening in that quiet, attentive way animals do, and Danny felt less alone. Winter arrived with a vengeance, the temperatures dropping and the wind howling across the open fields. Snow fell in thick blankets, transforming the landscape into a white expanse that was beautiful but unforgiving. Danny's walks to the estate became harder, his boots slipping on icy roads, his hands numb despite the gloves Tom had lent him. But he never missed a day. Ash depended on him, and that dependence was both a burden and a gift. It gave Danny a reason to keep going, even on the days when the cold seeped into his bones and the exhaustion felt unbearable. One afternoon, as Danny was mucking out Ash's stall, Tom appeared with a man Danny didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and lean, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore a heavy jacket and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew horses well. Tom introduced him as Marcus Calloway, a veterinarian who worked with rescue animals. Marcus had heard about Danny and Ash from Rebecca Thornton, the woman who ran the horse rescue, and he'd come to see the colt for himself. Marcus stepped into the stall, moving slowly so as not to spook Ash. He ran his hands over the horse's body, checking his legs, his teeth, his coat. Danny watched anxiously, his stomach tight with worry. After a few minutes, Marcus straightened, his expression thoughtful. "He's in good shape, considering where he started. You've done a remarkable job with him." Danny exhaled, relief flooding through him. But Marcus continued, his tone gentle, that leg is always going to be a limitation. He's not going to run like a normal horse, and any heavy work could cause permanent damage. You need to accept that his life will be different from what most people expect of a horse. Danny nodded, his throat tight. I know. I'm not trying to make him into something he's not. I just want him to be okay. Marcus smiled, his eyes kind. That's the right attitude. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. If you ever need veterinary care and can't afford it, call me. I do pro bono work for cases like this. Danny took the card, his hands trembling. Thank you. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. You're a good kid. Keep doing what you're doing. As winter dragged on, whispers began to spread through Lexington about the homeless boy and the crippled horse. Some people saw it as a heartwarming story, proof that kindness and determination could overcome adversity. Others saw it as a foolish waste of effort, a boy clinging to something that would never amount to anything. The divide in public opinion didn't surprise Danny. He had learned long ago that people would judge him no matter what he did. But it stung nonetheless. He tried to ignore the stares and the comments, focusing instead on Ash and the small community of supporters who had rallied around them. Maggie's diner became a gathering place for those supporters. Rebecca Thornton stopped by regularly, often bringing donations of feed or blankets. Father Patrick O'Brien came in for coffee and would slip Danny a few dollars when Maggie wasn't looking, insisting it was payment for the boys' help at the church, though Danny had never worked there. Even some of the diner's regulars began contributing, leaving extra tips or dropping off supplies they claimed they didn't need. The generosity was overwhelming, and Danny didn't know how to express his gratitude. He wasn't used to people caring, and the weight of their kindness pressed on him in ways he didn't fully understand. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting to reveal patches of brown grass and muddy earth. The world seemed to awaken, and with it so did something in Ash. The colt became more playful, tossing his head and prancing in the small paddock Tom had allowed Danny to use. His crooked leg still limited him, but there was a lightness to his movements that hadn't been there before. Danny watched him with a mixture of pride and wonder, marveling at how far they had both come. He had kept the horse alive, yes, but Ash had done something for him too. The colt had given him a reason to fight, to hope, to believe that he was capable of more than just surviving. It was during one of these spring mornings that Robert Whitmore made an unexpected appearance at the stable. Danny was brushing Ash when he heard the sound of expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor. He turned to see Whitmore standing at the entrance to the stall, his expression unreadable. The millionaire hadn't visited in months, and his sudden presence filled Danny with unease. Whitmore's eyes swept over Ash, taking in the horse's improved condition, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. It might have been surprise or regret, or even anger, but it was gone before Danny could place it. You've kept him alive, Whitmore said, his tone neutral. I didn't think you would. Danny straightened, his hand resting protectively on Ash's neck. He's my responsibility. I'm not going to let him down. Whitmore's lips twitched, not quite a smile. You've made quite a spectacle of yourself. People are talking about the boy and his horse. It's become a story. Danny didn't know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. Whitmore stepped closer, his gaze still on Ash. I'm hosting a charity event next month. A showcase for the estate's horses. I want you and the colt to be part of it. Danny's stomach dropped. Why? Whitmore's smile was cold. Because it makes for good publicity. The millionaire who gave a homeless boy a horse, and the boy who turned that horse into something respectable. It's the kind of story people love. Danny's jaw tightened. He's not a story. He's a living thing. Whitmore shrugged. Everything's a story if you tell it right. You'll participate, or I'll revoke your access to the stables. It's your choice. The threat hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Danny wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Whitmore exactly what he thought of his manipulations, but he couldn't risk losing Ash. The stable was the only place the horse had, and without it, Danny had no idea how they would survive. He swallowed his anger and nodded. Fine, we'll do it. Whitmore's smile widened. Good. I'll have Tom give you the details. He turned and walked away, leaving Danny standing in the stall, his hands clenched into fists. Tom found Danny later that afternoon, his expression apologetic. I tried to talk him out of it, but Whitmore doesn't listen to anyone. Danny shook his head. It's fine. I'll do whatever I have to do to keep Ash safe. Tom sighed. Just be careful. Men like Whitmore, they don't give without taking. Make sure you know what you're agreeing to. The charity event was held on a bright Saturday in late spring. The estate transformed into a showcase of wealth and elegance. White tents dotted the lawns, filled with tables laden with food and drink. Guests arrived in expensive cars, their laughter ringing out across the property. Whitmore's champion horses were paraded before the crowd, their coats gleaming, their movements precise and powerful. Danny stood at the edge of the event, feeling out of place in clothes Tom had lent him, a button-down shirt and slacks that were slightly too large. Ash stood beside him, his gray coat brushed until it shone, the crook in his leg barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. When it was their turn, Danny led Ash into the arena, his heart pounding. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the boy and the horse. Whitmore stepped forward, a microphone in hand, and began to speak. He spun a tale of generosity and redemption, painting himself as a benefactor and Danny as a symbol of resilience. The audience ate it up, their applause thunderous. Danny stood in the center of the arena, his face burning with humiliation, but he kept his expression neutral. This wasn't about him or Whitmore. It was about Ash, and he would endure whatever he had to for the horse's sake. As the event continued, people approached Danny, asking questions, offering praise, some even handing him money. He accepted it all with quiet gratitude, tucking the bills into his pocket. By the end of the day, he had more money than he'd ever held in his life, enough to buy feed for months, maybe even pay for veterinary care if Ash needed it. But the victory felt hollow. He had been paraded like a prop, his struggles commodified for the entertainment of the wealthy, and the taste of it lingered bitterly. That night, as Danny sat in the shed, counting the money by lamplight, Tom knocked on the door. The older man stepped inside, his face lined with concern. "You okay?" Danny nodded, though the tightness in his chest said otherwise. Tom sat down on the edge of the cot. "What Whitmore did today, it wasn't right. But you handled it well. You kept your dignity, and that's worth more than any amount of money." Danny looked at the bills spread across the table. "I just want to take care of Ash. I don't care about the rest of it." Tom nodded. "I know, and you're doing a damn good job. Don't let Whitmore or anyone else make you feel like you're not enough." The words settled over Danny like a bomb, easing some of the anger and shame. He looked at Tom, his eyes shining. "Thank you for everything." Tom's expression softened. "You don't have to thank me. You've earned every bit of help you've gotten." Summer came, and with it a new challenge. Whitmore announced that he was entering several of his horses in the county fair's amateur competition, a showcase for young riders and untrained horses. He suggested, in his usual manipulative way, that Danny should enter Ash. The idea was absurd. Ash wasn't trained for competition, and his leg made him unsuitable for anything requiring speed or precision. But Whitmore framed it as an opportunity, a chance for Danny to prove that the horse he had saved was worth something. The pressure from the community was immense. People who had supported Danny now urged him to try, to show the world what he and Ash could do. Danny was torn. He didn't want to push Ash beyond his limits, didn't want to risk injuring the horse for the sake of spectacle. But he also couldn't ignore the hope in the eyes of those who believed in them. After days of agonizing, he made his decision. He would enter the competition not to win, but to show that Ash deserved to be seen, to be valued, regardless of his limitations. Tom helped him prepare, teaching Danny the basics of leading a horse through an obstacle course, the simplest event in the competition. They practiced for hours, Ash navigating the poles and jumps with cautious determination. The day of the fair arrived, the air thick with heat and excitement. Danny led Ash into the arena, his hands trembling, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The crowd was massive, their faces a blur of curiosity and judgment. As the course began, Ash moved carefully, his crooked leg making each step deliberate. He stumbled once, nearly falling, and Danny's breath caught. But the horse recovered, pressing forward with a stubbornness that mirrored Danny's own. They didn't finish first or even close to it, but they finished, and when they crossed the line, the crowd erupted in applause, not for a victory, but for the sheer determination of a boy and a horse who refused to give up. Tears streamed down Danny's face as he wrapped his arms around Ash's neck, the horse's warmth grounding him. They hadn't won, but they had done something more important. They had proven that they belonged, that their worth wasn't defined by perfection or success, but by the fight to keep going. As the applause continued, Danny looked up and saw Tom standing at the edge of the arena, his face lined with pride. Beside him were Maggie, Rebecca, Father Patrick, and Marcus, all of them clapping, their expressions filled with joy. In that moment, Danny realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a family, not the one he was born into, but the one he had built through struggle and perseverance. The months that followed were marked by quiet growth. Danny continued to care for Ash, their bond deepening with each passing day. The money from the charity event and the fair allowed him to provide better care, and Ash thrived under the attention. Danny himself began to change, no longer the hollow-eyed boy who had dug through trash bins. He stood taller, spoke with more confidence, and allowed himself to dream of a future that didn't revolve around mere survival. Tom had begun teaching him about horses in earnest, and Danny proved to be a quick learner, his natural empathy for the animals translating into skill. One evening, as Danny sat in the shed, reading a book Rebecca had lent him about horse care, Tom knocked on the door. When Danny opened it, he found the older man holding an envelope. "What's this?" Danny asked. Tom handed it to him. "Open it." Inside was a letter from a local community college offering Danny a scholarship for their equine studies program, contingent on him finishing his high school education. Tom had submitted an application on Danny's behalf, using letters of recommendation from Maggie, Rebecca, and Father Patrick. Danny stared at the letter, unable to speak. "You've got a gift with horses," Tom said, "and you've got a future if you want it. This is your chance to make something of yourself." Danny's hands shook as he looked at the letter. "I don't know if I can." Tom's expression was firm. "You can. And you will. Because you've already done the hardest part. You've survived. Now it's time to live." As the sun set over Lexington, casting long shadows across the fields, Danny stood beside Ash, his hand resting on the horse's neck. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in his life, Danny believed he could face them. He had been given a gift, not the horse itself, but the chance to prove that even the most broken things could be made whole. And as Ash nuzzled his shoulder, the warmth of the horse's breath against his skin, Danny smiled. They had both been discarded, deemed worthless, but together, they had found something neither had expected. They had found hope. The envelope sat on the small table in Danny's shed for 3 days before he could bring himself to open it again. The scholarship offer felt like something from another life, a future so distant and impossible that acknowledging it seemed dangerous. He had spent so long focused on the present, on making it through each day, that the idea of planning beyond tomorrow was almost frightening. But the letter remained, its presence a constant reminder that change was not only possible but within reach. Tom had been patient, not pressing Danny for an answer but making his expectations clear through small gestures. He left pamphlets about the community college on the kitchen table, mentioned successful horse trainers who had started with nothing, and spoke casually about the skills Danny would need to build a real career. The message was subtle but persistent: you have potential, and it would be a waste to let it die. Danny heard it all, absorbed it, but the fear remained. What if he failed? What if he wasn't smart enough, wasn't capable of navigating the world of classrooms and expectations? It was Maggie who finally pushed him over the edge. One morning at the diner, as Danny was scrubbing pots in the back, she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression stern. "You planning on washing dishes for the rest of your life?" she asked bluntly. Danny paused, water dripping from his hands. "I don't know." Maggie stepped closer, her voice softening. That horse of yours has come a long way because you didn't give up on him. You owe yourself the same fight. Stop acting like you don't deserve a future." Her words hit harder than Danny expected, cutting through the layers of doubt and fear. That evening, he sat in the shed with the letter in his hands and made his decision. He would accept the scholarship. He would finish high school through the community program Father Patrick had mentioned, and he would take the equine studies courses. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing in his life had been easy, and he had survived it all. If he could keep Ash alive against impossible odds, he could handle classrooms and exams. The transition was jarring. Danny enrolled in the high school equivalency program, attending classes in the evenings after his shifts at the diner and his time with Ash. The teachers were a mix of encouraging and indifferent, some seeing his potential, others dismissing him as another struggling kid who would drop out before the year ended. Danny ignored the doubters, focusing instead on the work. Math was a nightmare, the numbers and equations foreign and frustrating, but he pushed through with the help of a tutor Father Patrick connected him with. English came more naturally, his love of reading translating into decent essays, though his grammar was rough. The hardest part was balancing everything. His days stretched from dawn to midnight, each hour packed with responsibilities. He woke early to care for Ash, worked at the diner, attended classes, and then returned to Tom's property to complete his chores. Sleep became a luxury, something he snatched in brief increments, and exhaustion became his constant companion. There were nights when he collapsed onto the cot, too tired to even remove his boots, and mornings when the alarm felt like a punishment. But he kept going, driven by the same stubbornness that had kept him alive on the streets. Ash noticed the changes in Danny, the shorter visits, the distracted energy. The horse would nuzzle the boy's shoulder, his dark eyes watchful, as if sensing the strain. Danny felt the guilt acutely, hating that his time with Ash had been reduced, but he reminded himself that this was for both of them. If he could build a career, he could provide a real home for the horse, something stable and secure. That goal kept him moving even when his body screamed for rest. Winter returned, bringing with it a bitter cold that seemed to seep into everything. The shed's heater struggled to keep up, and Danny often woke to frost on the inside of the windows. His hands developed cracks from the cold and the constant work, the skin red and raw despite the lotion Maggie forced on him. Ash's stall required extra care, the water bucket freezing overnight, the hay needing to be replenished more frequently. Danny's world narrowed to a series of tasks, each one necessary, each one exhausting. It was during this brutal winter that Robert Whitmore reappeared. Danny was in Ash's stall, wrapping the horse's legs in protective bandages Tom had taught him to use, when he heard the familiar sound of expensive shoes on concrete. He looked up to see Whitmore standing in the doorway, his coat pristine, his expression calculating. Danny's stomach tightened. Whitmore's visits were never without purpose, and that purpose was rarely benign. "You've been busy," Whitmore said, his tone conversational. "School, work, the horse. Quite the juggling act." Danny didn't respond, his hands continuing their work on Ash's legs. Whitmore stepped closer, his eyes on the horse. "He looks good. Better than I ever expected. You've surprised me, Daniel. That's not easy to do." Danny finished securing the bandage and stood, meeting Whitmore's gaze. "What do you want?" Whitmore's smile was thin. "I'm hosting another event in the spring. Bigger than the last one with more influential guests. I want you and the horse to be the centerpiece. A demonstration of what determination and care can achieve." Danny's jaw tightened. "No." Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "No?" Danny crossed his arms. "I'm not putting Ash through that again. He's not a prop for your publicity." Whitmore's expression hardened. "You're using my stable, my resources. I think you owe me a little cooperation." Danny's anger flared, hot and sudden. "I don't owe you anything. You gave me a horse you didn't want because it made you look good. Don't pretend it was anything more than that." The air between them crackled with tension, and for a moment, Danny thought Whitmore might retaliate, might throw him out or find some way to punish him. But instead, the millionaire's smile returned, colder now. "You've got spirit. I'll give you that. Fine. No event. But remember, This arrangement can end any time I decide. Don't push your luck. He turned and walked away, leaving Danny standing in the stall, his heart pounding. Tom appeared a few minutes later, his face grim. I heard. You handled that better than I would have. Danny leaned against the stall door, his legs shaky. How long until he kicks us out? Tom shook his head. Hard to say. Whitmore's unpredictable. But you've got friends now, people who will help if it comes to that. Don't forget that. Spring arrived with a burst of color, the fields around Lexington blooming with wildflowers and fresh grass. Danny finished his high school equivalency program, passing the final exams with scores that surprised even him. The accomplishment felt surreal, a piece of paper that represented months of struggle and sleepless nights. Maggie threw a small celebration at the diner, inviting Tom, Rebecca, Father Patrick, and a handful of regulars who had supported Danny along the way. It was awkward and overwhelming, but also deeply moving. These people had believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself, and their pride was palpable. The equine studies program at the community college began in the fall, and Danny threw himself into it with the same intensity he had brought to everything else. The courses covered anatomy, nutrition, training techniques, and business management, each one opening new doors in his understanding of horses. He excelled in the practical classes, his hands-on experience with Ash giving him an edge over students who had only worked with well-trained animals. The theoretical work was harder, requiring him to memorize terms and concepts that felt abstract, but he pushed through, determined to prove he belonged. Ash continued to thrive, his bond with Danny deepening into something almost telepathic. The horse seemed to understand when Danny was stressed, offering quiet comfort with a nudge or a soft whinny. Danny had started experimenting with light groundwork, teaching Ash to respond to verbal cues and subtle body language. The progress was slow, limited by the horse's leg, but it was progress nonetheless. Marcus, the veterinarian, stopped by periodically to check on Ash, always impressed by the horse's condition and Danny's growing expertise. It was Rebecca Thornton who suggested the idea that would change everything. She visited Danny one afternoon at the stable, watching as he worked with Ash in the small paddock. After a while, she leaned against the fence, her expression thoughtful. "Have you ever considered therapy work?" she asked. Danny paused, confused. "Therapy work?" Rebecca nodded. "Horses like Ash, who are calm and patient, can be incredible for people dealing with trauma or disabilities. It's called equine-assisted therapy. You'd be surprised how much demand there is for programs like that." Danny looked at Ash, the idea taking root. The horse had helped him in ways he couldn't fully articulate, had given him a reason to keep going when everything felt hopeless. Could Ash do the same for others? Rebecca must have seen the spark of interest because she continued. "I know a woman who runs a nonprofit that provides therapy sessions for veterans and kids in foster care. She's always looking for suitable horses and handlers. I could introduce you." Danny's mind raced. It was a possibility he had never considered, a way to give Ash purpose beyond simply existing. "I'd like that," he said finally. Rebecca smiled. "I'll set it up." The meeting with the nonprofit director, a woman named Laura Simmons, took place the following week. Laura was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened as Danny explained his situation, his background, and his bond with Ash. When he finished, she asked to see the horse. Danny led her to the stable, his nerves jangling. Ash was calm, as always, and Laura spent several minutes observing him, watching how he interacted with Danny and how he responded to her presence. "He's perfect," Laura said finally. "Gentle, patient, and clearly bonded to you. That's exactly what we need." She turned to Danny. "The program requires handlers to complete a certification course. It's intensive, about 6 months, but it covers everything you'd need to know. If you're willing to commit, I'd love to have you and Ash as part of our team." Danny's heart swelled. "I'm willing." Laura extended a hand, and Danny shook it, feeling the weight of a new beginning settling over him. The certification course was grueling, demanding more from Danny than anything he had done before. It covered psychology, communication techniques, safety protocols, and specialized training methods. He attended classes twice a week, often driving hours to reach the training facility, and spent his remaining time practicing with Ash. The horse adapted to the new routines with remarkable ease, his calm demeanor making him a natural for the work. Danny, meanwhile, struggled with the psychological components, the lectures on trauma and coping mechanisms hitting closer to home than he was comfortable with. But he pushed through, recognizing that understanding those concepts was essential if he wanted to help others. By the time Danny completed the certification, a full year had passed since Whitmore had handed him Ash. The transformation in both boy and horse was profound. Danny was no longer the hollow-eyed child who had scavenged for scraps. He stood taller, spoke with confidence, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Ash too had changed. The horse that had once been deemed worthless now moved with grace, his crooked leg a part of him rather than a limitation. Together, they had become something neither could have achieved alone. The first therapy session Danny facilitated was with a young girl named Sophie, 8 years old and recently placed in foster care after her parents' deaths. She was withdrawn and silent, her eyes haunted in a way Danny recognized all too well. Laura introduced Danny and Ash, explaining that they would be working together, and Sophie approached the horse cautiously. Danny knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "He's been through a lot just like you, but he's strong and he's kind. You can trust him." Sophie reached out a small hand, her fingers brushing Ash's nose. The horse stood perfectly still, his eyes soft, and after a moment, Sophie leaned her head against his neck and began to cry. Danny stayed beside her, not speaking, just offering his presence. He understood what she was feeling, the overwhelming grief, the fear, the sense of being utterly alone. Ash stood like a statue, absorbing the girl's pain with the patience only animals seem to possess. When the session ended, Sophie looked at Danny, her eyes still wet but less haunted. "Can I come back?" she asked. Danny nodded. "Anytime you want." As she walked away with her foster mother, Laura placed a hand on Danny's shoulder. "You're a natural at this. That girl needed someone who understood, and you gave her that." The therapy work became Danny's calling. Over the following months, he and Ash worked with veterans struggling with PTSD, children in crisis, and adults recovering from trauma. Each session was different, each person bringing their own pain and struggles, but the common thread was Ash. The horse had a gift for sensing what people needed, whether it was stillness, movement, or simply a presence that didn't judge. Danny learned to read the subtle cues, to guide without pushing, and to offer support without overwhelming. The work was emotionally exhausting, often leaving him drained, but it was also deeply fulfilling in ways he had never experienced. Robert Whitmore heard about Danny's new work through the grapevine, and his reaction was predictably self-serving. He reached out to Danny, suggesting that the therapy program could be expanded to Whitmore estates, offering the wealthy guests a chance to participate in something meaningful. Danny refused outright, unwilling to let Whitmore co-opt the work for his own gain. The millionaire was displeased but didn't push, perhaps recognizing that Danny was no longer the desperate boy he had once manipulated. The power dynamic had shifted, and Whitmore knew it. As Danny's reputation grew, so did opportunities. He was invited to speak at conferences about equine-assisted therapy, his story resonating with audiences who saw in him a testament to resilience. He remained humble, always deflecting attention to Ash and the people they served, but he couldn't deny the pride he felt. He had built something meaningful from nothing, had taken a broken horse and turned him into a source of healing for others. It was more than he had ever dreamed possible. Tom watched Danny's success with quiet pride, often remarking that the boy had exceeded every expectation. Maggie continued to feed him at the diner, though now she charged full price with a wink, insisting he could afford it. Father Patrick celebrated Mass with a little more joy, knowing that one of his flock had found his path. Rebecca introduced Danny to other professionals in the field, expanding his network and opening doors he hadn't known existed. And Marcus continued to provide veterinary care for Ash, refusing payment and claiming it was an investment in something worthwhile. On a warm evening in late spring, Danny sat in the paddock with Ash, the sun setting in shades of orange and pink. The horse grazed nearby, his movements unhurried, his presence a constant comfort. Danny thought about the journey they had taken together, from that first meeting behind the diner to this moment of peace. He thought about Whitmore's cruel gift, about the people who had helped him, about the children and veterans whose lives had been touched by Ash. It was a tapestry of pain and hope, woven together into something beautiful. Ash lifted his head, his ears pricking forward, and walked over to Danny. The boy stood, wrapping his arms around the horse's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You saved me," Danny whispered, "more than I ever saved you." Ash nickered softly, as if in agreement, and Danny smiled. They had been cast aside, deemed worthless by a world that valued perfection over heart. But they had proven that worth wasn't measured in speed or strength or the absence of flaws. It was measured in the willingness to keep going, to fight for something better, to refuse to let the world define you. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Danny led Ash back to the stable, their steps synchronized, their bond unbreakable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to help, new lessons to learn. But tonight, in the quiet of the Kentucky evening, Danny allowed himself to simply be grateful. Grateful for the horse who had given him purpose, for the people who had believed in him, and for the strength he had found within himself. He had been given the weakest horse, and together, they had become something extraordinary. And that, Danny thought, was the greatest miracle of all. 2 years had passed since Danny first wrapped his arms around Ash's neck in that forgotten stall at Whitmore Estates, and the world looked entirely different now. The shed behind Tom's house had been upgraded, insulated properly and outfitted with a real bed, a desk where Danny studied late into the night, and shelves lined with books about equine behavior and psychology. Tom had refused to accept rent, insisting that Danny's help around the property was payment enough, though they both knew the old man had grown attached to having someone around. The loneliness that had once filled the house had been replaced by the sounds of life, footsteps on the porch, laughter at the dinner table, the quiet companionship of two people who had found family in each other. Danny's work with the therapy program had expanded beyond what anyone had anticipated. What started as a few sessions a week had grown into a full schedule, with waiting lists stretching months ahead. Laura Simmons had been so impressed with Danny's natural ability that she had offered him a permanent position, complete with a modest salary that felt like a fortune to someone who had once survived on diner scraps. The money allowed Danny to finally contribute meaningfully to Ash's care, covering veterinary bills, quality feed, and even small luxuries like new blankets and brushes. More importantly, it gave him a sense of independence he had never known, the ability to stand on his own without relying solely on the kindness of others. Ash had become something of a local celebrity, his story spreading through Lexington and beyond. Newspapers ran features about the crippled horse who had become a healer, and television stations sent reporters to film segments about the boy who had refused to give up on him. Danny hated the attention, uncomfortable with being in the spotlight, but he endured it because it brought awareness to the therapy program and helped secure funding. Every interview, every photograph, every public appearance was a small sacrifice for the greater good. Ash, for his part, seemed unbothered by the cameras and microphones, his calm demeanor making him the perfect ambassador for the work they did. The clients who came to work with Ash were as varied as the reasons they sought help. There was Marcus, a veteran in his 40s who had returned from deployment with wounds that couldn't be seen but ran deeper than any scar. He had been closed off at first, his jaw tight, his answers clipped, but Ash had a way of breaking through walls. During their sessions, Marcus would stand beside the horse, his hand resting on the gray coat, and slowly, haltingly, he would begin to talk. About the friends he had lost, the guilt that haunted him, the nights when sleep felt impossible. Danny listened without judgment, offering only the occasional word of encouragement, and Ash stood like a sentinel, absorbing the man's pain with infinite patience. There was also Emily, a teenager who had aged out of the foster care system and was struggling to find her place in a world that felt hostile and unwelcoming. She reminded Danny of himself in so many ways, the guardedness, the mistrust, the sense of being utterly alone. Emily didn't talk much during her first few sessions, but she spent hours grooming Ash, her hands moving in slow, deliberate strokes, Danny recognized the therapeutic value in the repetition, the way the simple act of caring for another living thing could quiet the chaos in your mind. Over time, Emily began to open up, sharing her fears about the future, her anger at the system that had failed her, and her desperate hope that things might get better. Danny shared his own story with her, not to diminish her struggles, but to show her that survival was possible, that the road ahead was hard but not impossible. And there was little Caleb, a 6-year-old boy with autism who struggled to communicate and often became overwhelmed by the world around him. His parents had brought him to the program as a last resort, exhausted and desperate for anything that might help their son. Caleb was terrified of Ash at first, the horse's size and unfamiliar presence too much for his senses. But Danny was patient, never pushing, always allowing Caleb to set the pace. They started with simple exercises, standing near the paddock, tossing hay into Ash's stall from a distance, gradually closing the gap. It took weeks, but eventually, Caleb reached out and touched Ash's nose, his small hand trembling. The breakthrough was so profound that his mother burst into tears, and Danny had to turn away to hide his own emotion. These moments, the small victories and quiet transformations, became the heartbeat of Danny's life. Each person who walked away from a session with Ash carried a piece of hope with them, and Danny felt the weight and privilege of that responsibility. It was exhausting work, emotionally draining in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it was also the most meaningful thing he had ever done. He had found his purpose, not in spite of his past, but because of it. The pain he had endured, the loneliness and fear had given him a unique ability to connect with people who were suffering. He didn't just understand their struggles intellectually. He felt them in his bones. Tom had watched Danny's growth with a mixture of pride and amazement. The boy who had arrived at his property 2 years ago, thin and desperate, had become a young man with direction and confidence. They still worked together on the property, mending fences and caring for Tom's aging horses. But their relationship had evolved into something deeper. Tom had become the father figure Danny had lost, offering guidance without demanding control, providing support without expecting anything in return. And Danny had become the son Tom had never had, filling the empty spaces in the old man's life with energy and purpose. One evening, as they sat on Tom's porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Tom spoke in the quiet, measured way he had. "You've done something remarkable, Danny. Not just with Ash, but with yourself. You've taken everything life threw at you and turned it into something good. That takes strength most people don't have." Danny looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of work. "I didn't have a choice." Tom shook his head. "Everyone has a choice. You could have given up, could have let the world break you. But you didn't. That's what makes you remarkable." The words settled over Danny like a blanket, warm and comforting. He had spent so long focused on survival that he hadn't stopped to consider what he had accomplished. But sitting there, with Tom beside him and Ash grazing peacefully in the paddock below, Danny allowed himself to feel it. Pride, not the arrogant kind, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had fought for something and won. Robert Whitmore had faded into the background of Danny's life, a distant figure whose influence had diminished as Danny's independence grew. The millionaire had made a few more attempts to insert himself into Danny's success, offering partnerships and collaborations that always came with strings attached. Danny had refused them all, politely but firmly, and Whitmore had eventually stopped trying. There was a bitter irony in it. The man who had given Ash away to rid himself of a problem now watching as that problem became a source of admiration and respect. Danny suspected it grated on Whitmore, the knowledge that something he had discarded had become more valuable than anything he had kept. But the past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. It was a cold morning in late autumn when Danny received a call from Tom. The older man's voice was tense, his words clipped. "You need to get to the stable now." Danny's stomach dropped, fear flooding through him. He grabbed his jacket and ran, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. When he arrived at Whitmore Estates, he found Tom standing outside Ash's stall, his face grim. Inside, Ash was lying on his side, his breathing labored, his body trembling. Danny's heart stopped. "What happened?" Danny asked, his voice shaking. Tom shook his head. "I don't know. Found him like this about an hour ago. I called Marcus, he's on his way. Danny dropped to his knees beside Ash, his hands running over the horse's body, checking for injuries, for anything that might explain this. Ash's eyes were glassy, his breaths coming in short, painful gasps. Danny's mind went blank, panic clawing at him, but he forced himself to focus. "Stay with me, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't you dare leave me." Marcus arrived within minutes, his bag in hand, his expression serious. He examined Ash quickly, his hands efficient and sure, and after what felt like an eternity, he straightened. "It's colic. Severe but treatable. We need to get him up and moving, keep his system active. If we can get him through the next few hours, he'll be okay." Danny nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Together, they coaxed Ash to his feet, the horse staggering but cooperating. For the next 6 hours, Danny walked Ash around the paddock, his hand on the horse's neck, his voice a constant stream of encouragement. Marcus administered medication, monitoring Ash's vital signs, his calm presence a steadying force. By evening, the crisis had passed. Ash's breathing had evened out, his eyes clearer, and he was standing on his own. Marcus packed up his bag, exhaustion etched into his face. "He's going to be fine, but you need to watch him closely for the next few days. Colic can recur, and at his age, we need to be cautious." Danny nodded, relief flooding through him so intensely that his legs nearly gave out. "Thank you." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, kid. You kept him calm, kept him moving. That's what saved him." After Marcus left, Danny stayed in the stall, unwilling to leave Ash's side. Tom brought him a blanket and a thermos of coffee, then quietly left him alone. Danny sat in the straw, his back against the wall, watching Ash sleep. The fear he had felt during those hours was unlike anything he had experienced before, a visceral terror at the thought of losing the horse who had become his anchor. It forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. Ash wouldn't live forever. Horses had lifespans, and though Ash was still young, the reality of mortality loomed in the distance. The thought was unbearable, but Danny knew he couldn't ignore it. He would have to prepare himself for that inevitability, would have to find a way to carry on when the day came. But not yet. Not today. Today, Ash was alive, breathing steadily, his presence a reminder that life, for all its fragility, was also resilient. Danny reached out and rested his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart. "We're not done yet," Danny whispered. "We've still got time." The incident with Ash's colic became a turning point for Danny. It reminded him of how precious and fleeting life was, and it deepened his commitment to making every moment count. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, expanding the therapy program to include group sessions and workshops. Laura had been talking about opening a second location, and she wanted Danny to help lead the effort. It was a daunting responsibility, but Danny felt ready. He had learned so much over the past 2 years, not just about horses but about people, about healing, about the power of connection. The second location opened in the spring, a small facility on the outskirts of Lexington with room for 4 horses and a team of trained handlers. Danny split his time between the 2 sites, overseeing operations and mentoring new handlers. It was exhausting, the long hours and constant demands stretching him thin, but he thrived on the challenge. Ash remained the cornerstone of the original program, his steady presence a source of comfort for clients and staff alike. Danny made sure the horse's schedule was manageable, never pushing him beyond his limits, always prioritizing his well-being above all else. One afternoon, as Danny was leading a session with a group of foster children, a familiar face appeared at the fence. It was Kevin Price, Robert Whitmore's former business partner. Danny hadn't seen him in over a year, and the man's presence was unexpected. After the session ended, Kevin approached, his expression sheepish. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "When Whitmore gave you that horse, I thought it was a joke. I didn't think you'd last a week. But you've proven me wrong, and I wanted to tell you that." Danny studied him, unsure of how to respond. Kevin continued, "I left Whitmore's company 6 months ago. Couldn't stomach the way he operates anymore. I've been looking for something meaningful to invest in, and I think I've found it. He gestured toward the facility. I'd like to donate to your program. No strings, no publicity. Just a way to make up for my part in what happened. Danny was stunned. The offer was genuine, Kevin's regret palpable, and after a moment, Danny nodded. We could use the help. Thank you. The donation allowed the program to expand further, adding new equipment and hiring additional staff. It also brought a sense of closure to a chapter of Danny's life that had been marked by cruelty and exploitation. Not everyone who had wronged him was irredeemable, and Kevin's gesture was proof that people could change. It gave Danny hope, not just for the program but for the world in general. As the years continued to unfold, Danny's life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. He graduated from the community college with honors, earning a degree in equine studies and a certification in animal-assisted therapy. Job offers came from across the country, prestigious programs eager to hire someone with his experience and reputation, but Danny turned them all down. His place was here in Lexington with Ash and the community that had supported him. He had built something from nothing, and he wasn't about to walk away from it. Ash aged gracefully, his gray coat silvering at the edges, his movements slower but still sure. He had become a fixture at the therapy center, beloved by clients and staff alike. Children who had been too afraid to speak would whisper secrets into his ear, and veterans who had been too broken to hope would find solace in his presence. Ash had touched hundreds of lives, and his impact was immeasurable. Danny often thought about the day Whitmore had handed him the horse, the cruel calculation behind the gesture, and marveled at how wrong the millionaire had been. Ash wasn't worthless. He was priceless. On a warm evening in early summer, Danny stood in the paddock with Ash, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink. The horse was grazing, his movements unhurried, his demeanor peaceful. Danny thought about the journey they had taken together, the struggles and triumphs, the moments of despair and the moments of joy. He thought about the people they had helped, the lives they had touched, and the legacy they were building. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but it was better than anything he could have dreamed. Ash lifted his head and walked over to Danny, pressing his muzzle against the boy's chest. Danny wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, closing his eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. You gave me everything, Danny whispered. You gave me a reason to keep going, a purpose, a family. I'll never be able to repay you for that. Ash nickered softly, as if to say that repayment wasn't necessary, that the bond they shared was enough. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Danny led Ash back to the stable, their steps slow and synchronized. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to help, new lessons to learn. But tonight, in the quiet of the Kentucky evening, Danny allowed himself to simply be grateful. Grateful for the horse who had saved him, for the people who had believed in him, and for the strength he had found within himself. He had been given the weakest horse, and together, they had become something extraordinary. And that, Danny knew, was a story worth telling. The years had a way of softening the sharp edges of memory, but some moments remained crystalline in their clarity. Danny could still recall the exact texture of the cardboard he had slept on in that abandoned warehouse, the hollow ache of hunger that had been his constant companion, and the paralyzing fear that had gripped him every time he heard footsteps approaching. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, a different boy in a different life, but they were the foundation upon which everything else had been built. They reminded him of how far he had come and why the work he did mattered. 5 years after Robert Whitmore had handed him Ash, Danny stood at the entrance of the therapy center he now managed, watching as a van pulled into the gravel parking lot. The facility had grown exponentially, now occupying 10 acres of land that Laura Simmons had helped secure through grants and private donations. There were 4 horses in addition to Ash, each carefully selected for their temperament and trained specifically for therapeutic work. A small staff of certified handlers worked alongside Danny, and the waiting list for sessions had grown so long that they were considering expanding hours. It was overwhelming at times, but it was also proof that what they were doing was desperately needed. The van's doors opened, and a group of teenagers emerged, their faces guarded and skeptical. They were part of a residential program for youth who had experienced trauma, and this was their first visit to the center. Danny recognized the armor they wore, the carefully constructed walls designed to keep the world at a safe distance. He had worn that same armor once, and it had taken a gray horse with a crooked leg to help him take it off. He approached the group with a warm smile, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed and non-threatening. "Welcome," he said simply. "I'm Danny, and this is a safe space. No judgment, no pressure. You set the pace for everything that happens here." One of the teenagers, a girl with dyed black hair and a ring through her nose, crossed her arms defensively. "What's the point of this? We're supposed to talk to horses?" Danny didn't flinch at the challenge in her tone. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Some people find that just being around the horses helps. Others prefer to groom them, walk with them, or just sit quietly. There's no right or wrong way to do this." The girl looked unconvinced, but she didn't argue further. Danny led the group to the paddock where Ash stood, his gray coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The horse lifted his head as they approached, his ears swiveling forward with interest. "This is Ash," Danny said. "He's been doing this work for 5 years now, and he's helped more people than I can count. He's got a crooked leg, you can probably see it, and when he was born, people said he'd never amount to anything. They wanted to get rid of him, because he wasn't perfect. But he proved them all wrong, not by being what they expected, but by being exactly who he was." The girl with the black hair stared at Ash, and something in her expression shifted. "Can I touch him?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Of course," Danny said. She stepped forward, her hand extended, and Ash moved closer, pressing his nose gently into her palm. The girl's breath hitched, and for a moment, her carefully constructed walls wavered. Danny stepped back, giving her space, and watched as the connection formed. It was always this way, the first touch, the first moment of trust. That was where the healing began. Over the next hour, the teenagers took turns interacting with Ash and the other horses, some cautiously, others with growing confidence. By the time they climbed back into the van, their faces were different, not fully open, but softer, the skepticism replaced with something that looked like hope. As the van pulled away, Laura joined Danny at the fence, her arms crossed, her expression contemplative. "You have a gift for this," she said. "The way you connect with these kids, it's because you've been where they are. You understand them in a way most therapists never will." Danny shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just do what feels right." Laura smiled. "That's exactly what makes you good at it." She paused, then continued. "I've been thinking about something. The board wants to expand the program nationally, create a model that other centers can replicate. We need someone to lead that initiative, and I can't think of anyone better suited than you." Danny's stomach tightened. The idea of taking on such a massive responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. "What would that involve?" he asked. Laura explained the vision, training programs for new handlers, guidelines for selecting and preparing therapy horses, a curriculum that could be adapted to different communities. It would require travel, public speaking, and a level of visibility Danny had always avoided. But it would also mean that the work he and Ash had started could reach people far beyond Lexington, could change lives on a scale he had never imagined. "I need to think about it," Danny said finally. Laura nodded. "Take your time. But know that you've already proven you can do this. The only question is whether you're ready to take that step." That evening, Danny sat in the small office he had claimed at the back of the therapy center, surrounded by files and photographs of clients whose lives had been touched by the program. On his desk was a framed picture of Ash, taken during one of the early sessions, the horse standing calmly while a young boy leaned against his side. Danny stared at the image, his mind turning over Laura's offer. The work had always been about more than just him and Ash. It was about creating something that could outlast them both, a legacy that would continue to help people long after they were gone. But stepping into a leadership role on a national scale felt like stepping into a spotlight he had spent years avoiding. He thought about the teenagers who had visited that day, the girl with the black hair whose walls had cracked just enough to let Ash in. If expanding the program meant reaching more kids like her, how could he say no? He made his decision that night, calling Laura to accept the position. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Danny traveled to cities across the country, speaking at conferences and training new handlers. He collaborated with psychologists and veterinarians to develop a comprehensive curriculum, and he worked with architects to design facilities that prioritized both animal welfare and client comfort. It was exhausting, the constant travel and the pressure of leading such a large initiative, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time, Danny felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that would ripple outward and touch lives he would never meet. Through it all, Ash remained his anchor. No matter how far Danny traveled or how overwhelming the work became, he always returned to Lexington, to the paddock where Ash grazed, to the quiet moments when it was just the two of them. The horse was older now, his movements slower, his energy more measured, but his presence was as steady as ever. Danny cherished those moments, knowing that time was finite, that the day would come when Ash would no longer be there. But that day was not today, and Danny refused to let the shadow of the future steal the light of the present. One evening, as Danny stood beside Ash, the horse's head resting against his shoulder, he thought about the millionaire who had given him this gift. Robert Whitmore had meant it as disposal, a way to rid himself of a problem while maintaining the appearance of generosity. But in doing so, he had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just Danny's life, but the lives of countless others. It was a reminder that even cruelty, even selfishness, could be redeemed by those who refused to let it define them. Danny had taken what was meant to break him and turned it into something beautiful, and in doing so, he had proven that worth was not something given or taken away by others. It was something you claimed for yourself. As the stars began to appear in the Kentucky sky, Danny whispered to Ash, his voice filled with gratitude and love. "We did it, boy. We built something that matters, and no one can ever take that away from us." Ash nickered softly, and Danny smiled, his heart full. They had been cast aside, forgotten and dismissed, but they had risen from the ashes of their abandonment to become something extraordinary. And that was a story that would echo long after they were gone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.